Why don't architects go to heaven? Because Jesus was a carpenter, not an architect. Now that's one way to break the ice. Today, we're embarking on a humorous journey through the architectural history of New York. From the humble beginnings of the Colonial Era to the grandeur of the Gilded Age, the soaring heights of skyscrapers, and the bold statements of postmodern and contemporary designs. Buckle up, folks. Now let's take a sideways look at the history of architecture in New York. New York started out as New Amsterdam, and like any teenager going through a name change, it was a bit awkward. Picture this: the Dutch, fresh off the boat, trying to make this new land feel like home. So, what do? They start building houses that look like they've stepped right out of a fairy tale. I'm talking steep gabled roofs, wooden shoe-shaped windows, the works. But then, let's not forget, the British showed up. And like that popular kid in high school, everyone wanted to be like them. Suddenly, New Amsterdam was sporting a new look, going by the name New York and ditching the Dutch style faster than a teen ditches last season's trends. And so began the architectural puberty of New York. A confusing time filled with identity crises, style swaps, and the occasional rebellion. But hey, we all gotta start somewhere, right? From wooden shoe houses to federal style, let's see how New York matured. New York went through a classical music phase, only it was with buildings. You know, like when you suddenly start appreciating Mozart and Beethoven and you're like, man, I'm so cultured. That was New York in the federal period. So, what's this federal style? Picture this: a kid who just got their first Lego set. They're building these symmetrical, boxy structures. That's federal style. Straight lines, perfect symmetry, and a nod to those Greek and Roman classics. It was like New York was dressing up as a Roman senator for Halloween. Only the costume stayed on for like 20 years. And then came the Greek revival. Think of this as New York's rebellious teen phase, where it decided to amp up the drama. It was all about grand columns, wide porches, and thick moldings. The city was like, why just dress like a Roman senator when you can live like a Greek god? But, like any phase, this one had to end too. New York was growing faster than a teenager's appetite, and it needed a new style that could keep up. The city was about to trade in its toga for a suit of armor, and boy was it going to be a game changer. And then, someone discovered iron. Not for clothes, but for buildings. Scene script. Welcome to the Iron Age, where clothes were flammable, and so were buildings. Ah, the mid-19th century, a time when the city was starting to literally iron things out. Let's build with cast iron, they said. It's cheap, it's strong, and it's easily molded into fancy designs, they said. And so, cast iron architecture was born. And boy, did New York have a blast with it, until they realized that blast could also refer to explosion. You see, cast iron had a little issue with fire. It was like that one friend who enjoys a good party but goes a tad too wild. One small spark and boom! Your ornate cast iron building is now an impromptu bonfire. After a while, the city figured out that this was perhaps not the best idea. Who would have thought that building with a material that could turn your investment into a pile of hot molten metal overnight was a bad plan? After a few too many fires, New York decided to go for gold. New York decided to stop playing safe and start reaching for the stars, literally. Welcome to the Gilded Age, folks, where subtlety was as scarce as a quiet moment in Times Square. The city was like a teenager with their first paycheck, burning through architectural styles faster than a hipster through thrift stores. Now, let's talk skyscrapers. The Gilded Age was like a pre-game warm-up for the real show. The city had its eyes on the prize, and that prize was the sky. You see, New Yorkers are a competitive bunch. When they saw that their buildings were shorter than a giraffe on its knees, they said, "No way, Jose, enter the skyscrapers." These weren't your average run-of-the-mill tall buildings. No sir, these were the hold my beer, I'm gonna touch the sky kind of buildings. It was as if New York was playing a game of architectural Jenga with itself. And guess what? It worked. Soon the city's skyline was studded with these towering beauties, turning New York into a forest of steel and concrete. But here's the funny part. The architects, after designing these sky-kissing behemoths, looked at their creations and thought, well, these are functional, but could they be pretty too? And thus the stage was set for the next phase of New York's architectural evolution. But why stop at functional when you can also be decorative? New York decided to put on some makeup, and boy, did it go all out. Picture this: New York was like that teenager who just discovered eyeliner and decided to apply it with a paintbrush. That's Art Deco for you. It was all about bold geometric patterns, rich colors, and lavish ornamentation, like a peacock at a disco party. The Chrysler Building was swanning around with its shiny chrome nickel crown saying, "Look at me, I'm fabulous." But then, the 40s and 50s rolled around and New York decided it was time for a makeover. It was like the city woke up, looked in the mirror and said, maybe less is more. And so, mid-century modern was born. This was the era of sleek lines and functionality, the polar opposite of its flamboyant predecessor. The Seagram building, with its bronze and glass exterior, was like the cool kid in sunglasses, casually leaning against a wall and saying, "Who needs ornamentation when you've got style?" But the shift wasn't just aesthetic, it was philosophical. Art Deco was about opulence and extravagance, a reflection of the roaring 20s. Mid-century modern, on the other hand, was about simplicity and functionality, a response to the changing social and technological landscape. So, from the bold and brash Art Deco to the sleek and cool mid-century modern, New York had its fair share of architectural mood swings. But hey, that's what makes it so interesting, right? After a wild party, it was time for a hangover. Welcome to the architectural hangover, where everything is a blur and nothing makes sense. You see, after the mid-century modern's last call, New York decided it was time for some postmodern and contemporary architecture. Yes, the city that never sleeps decided to pull an all-nighter and mix things up. Now, postmodern architecture is like that one friend who gets a little too creative after a few drinks. Just when you thought you understood what a building should look like, bam! They're slapping classical columns on a skyscraper or making a building look like a giant pair of binoculars. It's a wild ride, folks. And then there's contemporary architecture, the sibling that decided to go sober but is still a bit out there. It's all about clean lines, open spaces, and a whole lot of glass. It's the person at the party who shows up in a minimalist black turtleneck and talks about sustainability. They're cool, they're hip, but you're never quite sure what they're on about. So, after the decorative phase had the city decked out like a flapper at a speakeasy, the Hangover era saw New York experimenting like a college student on spring break. It was a time of rebellion, a time of innovation, a time of, well, architectural confusion. And finally, New York decided to sober up. After a wild ride, New York decided to take a step back and appreciate what it had. Picture this. It's like waking up after a colossal party, looking around and thinking, wow, did I really build all of this? That was New York during the era of urban renewal and preservation. Suddenly, those old buildings that were once seen as outdated and drab became vintage and charming. A bit like your grandpa's daggy sweater suddenly becoming retro chic. It was a time of realizing that the past wasn't just something to bulldoze over but a treasure to be preserved. And so, New York started putting on its architectural glasses, squinting at its buildings, and saying, you know what? That's actually pretty cool. And as much as New Yorkers wanted to keep building skyward, they also realized that sometimes, it's not about how high you can go, but about how well you can remember your roots. And that's how New York went from wooden shoes to skyscrapers. So to sum up, New York's architectural journey was like a wild party. It started with the Colonial Era, our shy introvert phase. Then, we got a little more confident during the Federal period and Greek Revival, like that guy who finally starts dancing. The cast iron era was our metalhead phase, while the Art Deco to mid-century modern was our flamboyant, over-the-top costume phase. Postmodern and contemporary architecture, that's the morning after. But remember, no matter how wild the party, New York will always be New York.